CTBK gives executives and owners of mid-market businesses unparalleled confidence and clarity so you can focus on strategic objectives and organizational success. Their multidisciplinary advisors, accountants, and team members have a wealth of experience and are all available and responsive to each client to ensure the most effective advice, actions, and outcomes no matter the situation or complexity level. That experience base and one-team approach, combined with integrated and efficient way of operating, enable them to be truly proactive partners, doing the best thing for their client every time. Visit ctbk.com or call 716-630-2400 to learn how CTBK can work for you.
You are hate listening to Tim Graham and Friends.
It's Tim Graham and Friends, brought to you by CTBK, CPAs and Business Consultants. I'm Tim Graham of The Athletic, here with Jonah Bronstein of Bronstein Sports Plus. And, I think we have a fun topic. I want to see what we can do about engagement here on this particular topic. After watching Sam Reinhart lift the Stanley Cup again, it got me thinking who your favorite former Buffalo player is, whether it be the Bills, the Sabres, the Braves, or your least favorite, the one that drove you nuts, that went on and won a championship. And Jonah and I have a few that we'll kick around in just the topic, but I'm not going to pick. I have my thoughts on what a fan would think, but as somebody who grew up in Cleveland, I don't really have necessarily a thought on who would drive a stake through my heart to see raise a championship. I did not like seeing the Baltimore Ravens win the Super Bowl and Art Modell hold up the Lombardi Trophy right after abandoning Cleveland. Of course, that was back when I cared as much, although I think I'd probably still care about something like that. The Clevelander in me. I don't think that the sports writer or the journalist in me has made me so objective as that I'd forget that. So I'm guessing maybe if the Clippers had gone on to win NBA titles right after leaving Buffalo, then you'd know how I felt about that in particular. But there have been a lot of former Sabres, especially in recent years, that have gone on to win the cup. And then in the past, there have been some famous examples also. So just want to explore that. We're going to get into Game 7 matchup between the Indiana Pacers and the Oklahoma City Thunder. That's tomorrow night in OKC. And I'm going to tell you about another 3-letter abbreviation and my horror stories in being introduced to ChatGPT. Maybe, I don't know if we want to get to that sooner or later. It's comical. Not even just, I think it's fun. Jonah thinks it's funny that we should share it. I agree, because it is absurd what my experience was. And so yeah, we'll get to that. I'm not doing it just because I'm like, hey, I tried out this thing and you should know about it. It's like, I tried this thing out and it is pretty aggravatingly hilarious as to how it went.
Maybe you should ask ChatGPT to organize this podcast and outline what we should lead with.
Yeah, I think I want to lead with the fun topic because I want to get people engaged. Hey, subscribe to Tim Graham and Friends, please, on your whatever your listening device of choice is, whether you're listening on Spotify or Amazon, iTunes, whatever it is, subscribe to it. It helps us out, helps out our algorithm, helps drive that much more audience to us. And YouTube. And that's where I'm going to ask that you leave your comments on this topic. Go to the YouTube channel and an increasing number, I'll spit it out. An increasing number of the, holy smokes, maybe I need ChatGPT to help formulate this sentence. An increasing portion of this audience is watching on YouTube as opposed to listening to the podcast. And it's so they can watch me contort my face and try to spit out sentences, apparently. But put in the comments section what your vote is for your most notable Buffalo eventual championship winner. The list is pretty short, I think, of notable Bills that have gone on to win the Super Bowl. Yes, you can say Mike Lodish or Don Beebe, that type of it. But in terms of like a star who went on, I mean, Marshawn Lynch, right? I think really where you see it, though, is with the Sabres. And of course, lately, Ryan O'Reilly, Jack Eichel. I already mentioned Sam Reinhart, Kyle Okposo. I'm probably missing a couple others. Guys who the Sam Rodriguez and all the different former Sabres that have been on the Panthers. There's the Braves and Bob McAdoo, perhaps might be one to discuss, although that wasn't his fault. I mean, the team moved. He didn't demand a trade or leave as a free agent out of frustration. But there are some fun ones with the Sabres. Dominic Hasek, Dave Andrechuk, Alexander Mogilny. What comes to mind for you, Jonah? And there are different reasons. I have a take on Hasek's, but what comes to mind for you, Jonah?
I mean, I think maybe looking back on my life, it's different for me because I was a bit of a Buffalo sports fan growing up, and then in the media, not as much of a fan. So the emotions are a lot different. I think Hasek was difficult for a lot of Buffalo sports fans and myself because the Sabres did almost win with Dominic Hasek and had a championship caliber run. And it did see, and he left, kind of in contentious manner with the Sabres organization. And it did have that aura of he had to go somewhere else. He couldn't win in Buffalo, but he could win somewhere else. And I think those are the hardest ones to take. And maybe what some fans are seeing and feeling and experiencing with Eichel and Reinhart and O'Reilly in the recent run with these ex-Sabres, a little bit different in that they never got close as Buffalo Sabres, and it was different. And then I think back to, not many of these guys did it, but the Bills who were part of those Super Bowl teams and then went on to other teams. And Cornelius Bennett got to the Super Bowl with the Atlanta Falcons, and Don Beebe did win. And some of these players didn't get to the Super Bowl, but, Bruce Smith was on good Redskins teams, Washington teams that
like Mike Lodish won 2 Super Bowls with the Denver Broncos, but name a memorable Mike Lodish, Mike Lodish was a good player, but it's like, all right. I mean, people are now scrambling to Pro Football Reference to look up Mike Lodish's career because you don't remember much of that. So that doesn't hit. I mean, Don Beebe, of course, had big games and the memorable play in the Super Bowl with forcing Leon Let's fumble that made him a popular player. But,
I think Don Beebe is the one that was, well, one of the only ones that did win. And it happened soon after the Bills Super Bowl run. I think that was 96, and the Bills were in the Super Bowl, the 94 season, 2 years earlier. And I think you're conflicted. I think in some ways you're happy, especially for a popular player who seems like a nice guy, to see him have that moment. But it kind of feels like watching your ex-girlfriend get married or something like that. You don't really want to see it, or you do want to see it, but you don't like it emotionally, and then you feel guilty about that. Maybe it's better when they don't win, and you kind of can root for them a little bit, and then they don't win, and you don't have to deal with those conflicted emotions and wondering who to root for. But I don't know if I have a great answer about this, because in the last 20 years or so, I haven't felt emotionally about that. And maybe as a media person, if you think this person, this athlete, was good to cover and deserving of happiness more so than some other players, then you'd like to see them win. And if they were a bit jerky, or you didn't like covering them or dealing with this person, then you're not as happy to see them win. And that colors it, whether it should or shouldn't. But I think that's how a lot of people like us probably feel watching these things happen.
Yeah, I was just thinking about those really good Sabres teams in the mid-aughts. You don't think of those. I mean, Ryan Miller did not win a Stanley Cup. Chris Drury did not go on to win a Stanley Cup. He'd already won a Stanley Cup with the Colorado Avalanche. But Daniel Briere had some deep runs with the Flyers, but did not win a cup. I'm wondering if there are guys off of that team. Now, I think people would not have been happy with Drury winning the cup. I don't think. Maybe more so Danny Briere. That's a good one. That's a good one to ponder, because what would fans have thought? Because the anger was directed towards Larry Quinn and Tom Golisano and Darcy Regier regarding those departures. But there was also some, you know, obviously the both of those guys left in different circumstances for each. Chris Drury thought he had a contract, and turned out that it wasn't signed. It was never, the Sabres never signed the deal. It was never done, or they were pussyfooting around a little bit, because they didn't want to upset Briere, so they let it linger. And then Drury was like, well, I reached free agency. I'm going to test the market now. Sorry, everybody. And then Briere wanted to stay badly, and the Sabres had ignored him. Brian Campbell, right? He won a Stanley Cup. That was one that I think people were happy with. That's one that just pops into my head. But going back on that team, there's not a lot of guys that did go on. They were very good players, but did not go on to do much from a championship standpoint with their subsequent teams. Maxim Afinogenov did not. Thomas Vanek did not. Yeah, I think I've pretty much gone through most of the stars there. Teppo Numminen was at the end of his career. A Drew Stafford or Henrik Talinder, kind of, just bounced around a bit. Let me just double check on Vanek, just because that might have been one that slipped through. He played on 83,000 teams after he left the Sabres. So, no, he did not win a cup. My memory was correct on that one. But that was such a likable team that fell short. That would be, I do recall people being pretty happy for Brian Campbell. So going back to like Dave Andreychuk, I think people were happy for Andreychuk when he won as captain of the Tampa Bay Lightning, because the Sabres traded him after the end of his first stint. And then his second stint was during the bankruptcy era. That was just ugly hockey. Everybody was upset. Nobody wanted to go to the rink, and he left. And it wasn't like anybody would blame any Sabre at all for wanting to go somewhere else. And he went to a team that was considered a laughingstock. Tampa Bay at the time, they were an outpost. It was the exact opposite of what it is now. That both teams in Florida were considered jokes. And Andreychuk went down there because of his experience and all he'd accomplished. He becomes the captain, and they win the Stanley Cup. They won the first of the franchise's Stanley Cups. He's got a statue outside the arena. And so I think, but Andreychuk also was not one of those guys that fans, yeah, they loved him when he was a Sabre, but there were so many other characters or players on those teams when Andreychuk was here his first time. Pat LaFontaine, Alexander Mogilny, Housley, and, those guys. Andreychuk was, a lot of people thought he was a bit of a gimmick player because of all of his goals being scored on the power play. I recall as he was approaching 500 career goals, it would be a topic in the press box of, is Andreychuk a Hall of Famer? Which is kind of ridiculous to think about now, but it was because, hey, he scores all his goals are just power play goals. He doesn't score at even strength. He's not known for being a good defensive player, all that type of thing. But of course, he wins the Stanley Cup, and he is every bit a Hall of Famer. Mogilny, similarly, he wins one with the Devils, but as a fourth line player, 12 minutes a game, doesn't contribute much. And he had been gone from Buffalo for so long. He'd already gone to Vancouver and wore out his welcome there. So I don't recall Sabres fans really having much of a reaction there. But Hasek, that's the one that I think people look back on and say, wow, good for Hasek, because he's known as maybe the greatest Sabre of all time. And Gilbert Perreault is in that conversation too, especially if the age of the person in the discussion. But I think there's a younger fan that looks back, and the younger fan that also looks at Alexander Mogilny's career and says, why isn't he in the Hall of Fame? But at the time, if you were covering these guys or paying attention at the time, why Alexander Mogilny's not in the Hall of Fame. And you would know why Sabres fans hated that Hasek won a Stanley Cup, and he eventually wins a second. He orchestrated his way out of town and kept threatening retirement. Darcy Regier finally trades him. He didn't call the bluff. And Hasek not only has created so much leverage for himself that not only does he force his trade, he dictates who the Sabres receive in return, because he says, I'm going to the Red Wings, but you can't weaken them. I want to win a Stanley Cup. And so the Sabres get back Slava Kozlov in return, who is a good player, but he wasn't a foundational piece on Scotty Bowman's Red Wings. And of course, Hasek wins the Stanley Cup. But it's just, it's interesting to go back and think about some of these. Did you have any your recollection then of Hasek when he left and how you felt about that?
Yeah, I think it was disappointing that, maybe the greatest player in team history, or one of the greatest players in franchise history, left with that kind of discord. And, it's good to see that the relationship has been repaired between the Sabres and Dominik Hasek and the fan base over the years. But at the time, it seemed like maybe that wouldn't be the case. And it was tough to see him win. I think some fans maybe had hoped that he was past his prime and a little too old, and that wasn't the case. But I don't also remember it being like that, sad or being apoplectic about it. It just sort of happened, and these things happen in sports. I think the general feeling that you can't win a championship in Buffalo, even if you're the greatest goaltender in the game, but if you go to another franchise that's run a little better and has other great championship players and a championship culture, and it does happen, stings. And it hasn't happened with the Bills, but it feels like it could have or could in different periods of time. So that's kind of what I remember thinking and feeling, or recognizing others thinking and feeling at the time.
When I interviewed Dominik Hasek for the Athletics Top 100 Players of All Time project a couple of years ago, I asked him about that time when he orchestrated his trade, and he said, if you don't trade me, I'm going to retire. And I said, would you really have retired? And we were eating breakfast at the Harbor Center, and he takes a big bite. I can remember it because it was funny. He takes a big bite because he knows he's going to think about it for a while. And I think he was trying to buy some time. So he shovels a big bite of food into his mouth, leans back in his chair, pushes kind of away from the table, and he's got this smile on his face while he's chewing. He's nodding his head, like just slightly. And you can, you've been in interviews like this before, where you can tell like there's going to be a payoff at some point. Like he's deciding that he's going to give me something, I think, because I hadn't seen this reported anywhere since. And so you can get the sense like he's almost thinking, all right, I can tell this story now. So finally he swallows and he says, well, you can tell by how the remainder of my career went and how I couldn't stay away from the game what the answer to that question would have been. In other words, he was bluffing. And had Darcy Regier just said, Dom, we're not trading you, you're going to have to retire, Dominik Hasek probably would have shown up to training camp and remained the Buffalo Sabres goaltender, which also has to be a kick in the teeth a little bit for the Sabres fans. Now, at the time too, I think what played into it, there was some kind of, fans wanted him gone because of the constant threats to retire, whining, the Jim Kelly incident in which he attacked the Buffalo News's venerable hockey writer, created a lot of embarrassment for the team. The holdout, there was contract stuff. The injuries, questions about whether or not he was really hurt when he just wasn't playing. And, but another thing that played into it was that Marty Biron was wildly popular. And much like when Bills fans would talk about, hey, let's just let Frank Reich see if he can win us a Super Bowl after Jim Kelly couldn't for a couple of years. And there were actually fans that were saying, look, Jim Kelly's done, just put Frank Reich in there. I think there was a sentiment similar to that about Marty Biron. And also Ryan Miller was in the pipeline. He had already been drafted and he was doing well. I don't know if he'd won the Hobie Baker yet at that point when Hasek was traded, but fans were like, see ya, Dom. And so it's interesting. I know that we've been talking about Hasek here for a long time, but I just find that interesting how things change. And I think that currently Sabres fans look back on Hasek so fondly that they forget what it was like at that time. And I think Sabres fans also, in talking to them, are appreciative that Hasek won the Stanley Cups because it allows them to avoid that if you want to have a debate about the greatest goaltender of all time, whether it's Patrick Waugh or Martin Brodeur or Terry Sawchuk, you want to put them in the conversation. There was a time when you said, it can't be Hasek because he didn't win a championship. And I think a lot of times that's a bullshit point to make in an argument. But I think Sabres fans now can look back and stake a claim that they had the greatest goaltender of all time and got to watch the greatest goaltender of all time play all those years. And they can point to actually say hey, the guy won a couple of cups. So he must be, he's clearly he's the best. And he was the Athletic, at least on the Athletics in that project that we did, Hasek was the greatest goaltender of all time.
I'm curious from our listeners, our Fs, or people commenting in the YouTube comments, just the general consensus. Do you tend to root for former players and beloved former players to get championships with another team after they leave Buffalo, or do you tend to root against them? Or is it individualized? Because I'm curious at times, when Jack Eichel was playing in the Cup Finals with Vegas, it seemed like all of Buffalo was rooting against Vegas. Last year with Florida, there seemed to be a lot more rooting for Florida. There was some rooting against Florida, and I never quite I understood it, but I didn't quite get my handle on how people generally felt. It was sort of confusing whether you wanted to see all these Sabres win with the Panthers or not, and what that meant in the framework of being a Sabres fan. If it changes year to year, or if it's the circumstances why they left, or who the player is, or why, or who you are. So I'm curious how people generally feel about that. And then I was just thinking about this while you were talking, in a slightly different context, but the same vein. Something I don't believe that's happened yet, but could happen, and at some point probably will happen. I think the thing that might sting the most would be seeing something like Nate Oates win a championship with Alabama, or a coach that has to leave University of Buffalo or one of the mid-major colleges in Buffalo to win somewhere else because you can't really get to the Final Four. You can't get to the college football playoff at these programs, and you have to move on up because that plays into Buffalo's inferiority complex, but it's also just a reality of mid-majors and power conferences and the way college sports are. And now because that always was in play with coaches, now it's much more in play with athletes and transferring and seeing that UB or St. Bonaventure had a great player as a freshman or sophomore, then they transferred somewhere else and they won a championship or got close to winning a championship somewhere else. And that just further reflects that you can't win at this level, and plays into the feeling that you can't win in Buffalo because, maybe something miraculous happens with the NIL, but it doesn't feel like UB or Bonaventure or Canisius and Niagara are any closer to reaching that level, and in some ways getting further and further away. So if and when that happens with a football player or a men's or women's basketball player or a coach, that might be one of the most stinging ones to see them cutting down the nets and realizing maybe it could have happened here because they were here, but also recognizing that it probably couldn't have happened here.
Great point. Who's come the closest?
Nate Oates was the one that's come to mind because he got to the Final Four. Is
there a player that transferred? I guess that's
Curtis Jones was a player that transferred out of Buffalo and was sixth man of the year in college basketball last year. And Iowa State was a high-seeded team that went somewhat far in the tournament. I don't know how far exactly they got, but they didn't get all the way. I can't think of a perfect example, one that did win a championship. There probably is one. Especially if you think of somebody that maybe coached, if you go back in time far enough, and somebody that coached here earlier in their career and moved on, and after multiple stops was a championship coach or an assistant with a championship
Buddy
team.
Ryan.
Yeah, yeah.
You
But
wouldn't
I
know who Buddy Ryan was at UB though.
yeah, and I think it would have to be a move once removed to really feel like, oh, this is the championship that got away, or the championship the coach that got away. And now in this transfer portal
John
era,
Beeline. I mean, he
yeah,
made some runs at it, but
yeah,
he's also
got
a
to the
local
national
boy. He
championship
wasn't
game.
just
Yeah,
passing through. That's a local boy. That's different. That's like if Dave Andrechuk was from Clarence, or Alexander Mogilny grew up uh, in Hamburg. It's a
right.
little different that way. But
Yeah,
anyway,
if Brian Hodgson were to get to that level, even not just winning a championship, like if he were to take South Florida deep into the tournament and realize that maybe Buffalo could have hired him and had that kind of run with him as the coach, and now he's doing it somewhere else, that would be difficult.
yeah. Anyways, I enjoyed the topic. Or I liked thinking about it. It was sending me down a lot of different side roads. So usually when I start thinking of things in that regard, it makes for a good topic. But I also wanted to, Jonah and I as journalists and thinking more as chroniclers at the stages of our lives that we're in now, as opposed to growing up and being a fan and like having a passionate commitment, whether it be positively or negatively, towards certain teams and certain players. That's why I thought it was good to bring in the listeners and the viewers on this to let us know what you think. So yeah, please comment, put a comment in there, and Jonah and I get in there and we have discussions with folks, and we appreciate the feedback, and we give you feedback in return. And while you're
And
at it, please, like I said, subscribe. It really helps us out, and it helps get the show out to more folks.
to touch on the Braves real quick, probably the one for the Braves was a coach, Jack Ramsey, winning the 1977 championship as the
Dr.
coach of the
Jack.
Blazers very soon, I think 2 years after he had left Buffalo, and was the coach of the best Braves team. And, maybe if he stays, something plays out a little bit differently. And then even Bob McAdoo did win a championship with the Lakers. It's a little bit different because he played for the Knicks, and I believe the Pistons, before he was with the Lakers, and wasn't the star MVP player with the Lakers that he was with Buffalo and later early in his career. But I think the regret for Braves fans, the biggest regret, is that the Braves left Buffalo and didn't exist anymore. But it was also that they did have these great players, not just Bob
So
McAdoo
many
and Randy
great
Smith
players.
and Ernie DeGregorio on good teams, but towards the end, they had Adrian Dantley, the rookie of the year, who became, an all-star player and didn't win a championship, but got close. Moses Malone was only on the roster for 3 days, but they had him, and they could have had an opportunity to have Moses Malone and Adrian Dantley together if they weren't, selling the team off for parts and doing the things that they were doing at the time. And then I believe it was 1982, Moses Malone was the MVP and Adrian Dantley was the runner-up. And the Braves, if they were,
Randy Smith was the All-Star Game MVP.
yeah,
So that's three bona fide league validated stars of your five starters. Three of them were great, not just good players; they were great.
right. So if that was a franchise that was trying to win it in their later years and trying to maximize their talent instead of their finances, they could have had these great players, and maybe they are a
Ben
championship
Nader.
team. Yeah. If you have Moses Malone and Adrian Dantley on the same team in 1982, maybe you're the NBA champions, or you're probably very competitive. And then I just found it interesting that you really can't have this discussion with the Buffalo Bandits, because the Bandits have won so many championships, and I don't think there's anybody that played in Buffalo and then went on. It might have been, and somebody might be able to point this out, but it was great for another team, because the Bandits just bring all the great players to Buffalo, and they didn't win somewhere else, but they win here.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's the opposite, right?
Right.
Everybody wins. Well, but there, yeah, like you say, there was that period.
And similar to
all
the
the legends have won. Like all the great players that have come through the Bandits have won championships with the Bandits, right? I mean, there's nobody who slithered through that little.
yeah, I can't think of a great Bandit that didn't win with the Bandits. There were years they didn't win and eras where they didn't win, but the great players from the early days and the more recent days seems like they all have rings. And then similar to that college point I made earlier with the high school athletes, this isn't really about championships, but I think it's disappointing when you see athletes that are great and could win high school championships here and they have to move on for recruiting purposes or you know, can't stay here and have to go to prep schools or out of state schools. And that's disappointing. And I think there's probably an example there of maybe an athlete that won a big time championship somewhere else and you're happy for them, but you're not as happy as maybe it would be if they had stayed home and won.
There is a Western New York connection to the game 7, well, to the entire series between the Indiana Pacers and the Oklahoma City Thunder. It's Rochester. Is that Western New York? It's Western New York, right? We kind of exclude it. I remember when I moved here in 2000.
Part of the state, but
yeah,
some people call it Finger Lakes region. There's some state regions in Western New York. In some ways, when they draw that map, cuts off in the counties in between Buffalo and Rochester, but it's in the western part of the state. And I think people downstate and Albany consider Rochester to be Western New York. And the old Empire State Games, the Western region included Buffalo and Rochester together.
Yeah, I have to keep that in mind when I do say Western New York. I immediately have kind of trained my brain to think, all right, do I mean Rochester? Because sometimes it does mean Rochester when you're talking about just the fan base, but then sometimes I want to say Buffalo area and I have to specifically say Buffalo or Erie County or whatever. But yeah, Western New York does include Rochester, although I think it's kind of fallen out of favor when I talk to people about Western New York. It just becomes synonymous with Buffalo. And we were just having this conversation about this specific player with somebody a couple of weeks ago, weren't we, about whether they considered Rochester to be Western New York?
Yeah, I think it's a big debate. And, I don't know. I haven't had this conversation too many times with people from Rochester because I think that's maybe the more relevant opinion. And I think it's different. I think it is Western New York in context of the whole state sometimes, but I also think the descriptor of WNY as an area sometimes doesn't include Rochester. That's Rochester area or greater Rochester. So I think it's both. Sometimes I do think Western New York encompasses more than just the 716 area code and Buffalo Niagara region, and sometimes I think it doesn't.
Jamestown's a lot farther away from Buffalo than Rochester, right? And yet Jamestown's considered Western New York. And I see Jamestown stories in the A block of the local news, but you don't see it as, you know what? You don't. All right.
Yeah, but Fort Erie's closer to Buffalo than Rochester, and is that Western New York?
Or how about just Niagara Falls, New York? That to me seems like it's always a neglected part of local news. It's like things stop at the Erie County border, or maybe they'll go into North Tonawanda. But there's got to be a ton of news happening in Niagara Falls, and Niagara Falls doesn't make the news much, does it?
Well,
then not just the television, but the newspaper.
Does. I mean, Niagara Falls is definitely West New York, I would say.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
I'm just saying it's local. It should be covered more locally than it is, I think, by all the news outlets.
There's also that linguistic debate, semantic debate about whether Western New York is upstate New York. It's upstate in relation to New York City, but it's not as far upstate as other parts of upstate New York. And some people don't wish to call Western New York upstate New York, but downstate they do.
Yeah, I think what it comes down to is there's upstate and downstate, and New York City is downstate and everything else is upstate in a lot of people's minds. And then if you care to get more nuance than that, then you may. But some people take offense like they do ranch with their wings. Like there's just people look for reasons to be offended. So
We
this,
should ask ChatGPT.
well, I will, but the Rochester guy, let's talk about game 7 first. And the
Thomas
guy from
Bryant's his name.
Rochester,
He has won a championship with the Denver Nuggets before.
give us his name again, because I think I stepped on you.
Thomas Bryant, backup center, was very good in earlier parts of the playoffs, Eastern Conference Finals against the Knicks. Hasn't done a whole lot in this series. In fact, I wonder if I look it up if he's even fallen out of the rotation a little bit. But yeah, I mean, that'll be cool for Rochester basketball fans. He does fall into that category of somebody who played his early high school career in Rochester. I'm forgetting which high school, but then went to an out-of-state prep school later on in his career. Rochester has a lot of great basketball players that have made the NBA or been high-level Division I players, a lot more than Buffalo has in recent years.
How about this? Here's a question for you, Jonah, because I hear that there might be a Western New York, a Buffalo area player drafted in the NHL this year. Used to be, and this even predates Patrick Kane, but used to be there were several, and you were talking about whether they were going to be as early as the second or the third, or maybe even the whatever. What's more fertile ground these days, Rochester basketball or Buffalo area hockey?
I'd have to look at the list. I mean, there does seem to be a Buffalo area player drafted about every year. You know, there's two. Well,
but it's
one,
used to be a few a year. It used to be pretty, that I had to write this story every year when I was, for 7 years that I covered the National Hockey League, the local story heading into the draft of the locals. And I'd write capsules that sometimes it was 3 guys, but sometimes it would be 7 guys. And now they're talking this year, there's 1 guy maybe. And in recent years, there hasn't been much either.
and I don't think, I could be wrong, I don't think there's a Rochester area player expected to be drafted in the NBA this year. Now, there's only 2 rounds of the NBA draft, and there's 7 in the NHL. But there's at least 4, if not more, Rochester players in the NBA right now, including one that played at the University of Buffalo, Jonathan Williams, and now goes by Nate Williams, as an NBA player.
Great story.
Yeah, and there might be more. I can only think of 4 off the top of my head. Thomas Bryant being one of them, Jalen Pickett, Isaiah Stewart the other one, and there are none from Buffalo at this point.
Do you think it comes down to whether or not it's Western New York, because it's a media thing, right? Buffalo has its own TV stations and newspaper and considers itself Western New York. And it only goes as far east until Rochester's TV stations and the Democrat and Chronicle can service their audience. And then it's like, hey, it's up to you guys from here on east, and then you guys hand it off to Syracuse at some point. That's kind of what it goes down to. And then Syracuse is obviously considered is in that central New York.
Right. And there's official state regions that regard Rochester as being part of the Finger Lakes region.
But I don't get the Niagara Falls neglect, other than that the Niagara Gazette exists as a newspaper, but it's not like Niagara Falls has its own set of TV stations.
Yeah, I don't know if I see that, though. I think Niagara Falls does get some coverage, maybe a little less than it did years ago, just because of shrinking staffs in the media and things like that. But I think that that local media tries to cover Niagara Falls as much as Buffalo when it can.
Yeah, but I mean, what gets more coverage? Niagara Falls, or pick your suburb. I mean, Amherst is maybe a loaded one because it's so big, but I mean, what gets, Clarence or Niagara Falls? I'm sure Clarence gets way more coverage than Niagara Falls does, or East Aurora. They're covering shit in East Aurora way faster than they are in Niagara Falls. I don't know. It's just me. And that's anecdotal. That's just me. Like, as somebody who does, and as you know, watches a ton of local news. I love the local news coverage, 2, 4, and 7. And if I wasn't a DirecTV household, I'd be watching Spectrum. I enjoy comparing who's doing what. I like analyzing it in my own mind. I don't write about it or anything. I'm not Alan Pergament, but I like to compare, like, why are they covering this versus this station covering this? And, Channel 2 is clearly the, they have a certain direction, and Channel 4 is, way more nuts and bolts. And then Channel 7 is heavy community oriented news, and they each have their own lane that they're trying in their own, anyways.
I think maybe what you're seeing is just a function of proximity and driving distance and how easy it is to get a camera somewhere. Because I think, I'm in sports, which is a little different, but I'm in these newsrooms, or I'm in a newsroom right now, and I've worked in newspapers in the past, one of them being a Niagara Falls newspaper. But I think that there's an attempt to treat Niagara Falls as a core part of the DMA, is what we would call it in television, direct market area, or the coverage area. In that, especially in sports, I don't think a Niagara Falls high school team, or maybe Niagara gets covered slightly less than Buffalo and Canisius, but I think that's proximity based. I don't think it's considered that it's a little bit out of the readership or the viewership area. Whereas sometimes down in the southern tier, it is in the DMA or the coverage readership area, but there is some wonder about, how many viewers and readers do we really have? How many papers are getting circulated down in Franklinville compared with the hot zip codes or the suburbs closer to Buffalo? But I don't think Niagara Falls is treated quite like that. I do know in some ways with newspapers, I don't think this applies to television, that there's more advertisers in some of these suburbs, or easier to sell advertisements in Clarence, Amherst. I work for smaller papers and things like that, to where Niagara Falls still gets covered, but the business of it, if you're covering, maybe a new restaurant opening or something like that, there's maybe a slight attraction to do things in Amherst or Clarence or even Lockport, where you might have more customers than you do in the city of Niagara Falls.
Yeah, I get that. This was just a few days ago, and again, it's not a critique. I guess all of this is a critique, but it's not a criticism, or I'm not being negative about this, but this is kind of where it popped into my head. Just a few days ago, I was watching Channel 7, and this was in their A block, which is their, the first segment before the first commercials after the news begins, which is the most important stuff that it deems the most important stories. And one of those stories was a car had hit a child on a bike in Jamestown. And I think the child, as I recall, the child was going to be okay. But I was like, really? I mean, and there was no camera involved. It was a graphic, which is what TV stations can do now too. You don't have to necessarily send a camera to the scene. You can get the information through news release or talking to the police department and whatever, followed up on it. And you can come up with a graphic with Google Maps, and comes down, and it's dynamic and looks good on TV, and it looks fine. But I was just like, wow, and then it just got me thinking, like, how much, I mean, obviously, if you're in Jamestown and you have Spectrum, or you have whatever, your local channels are Buffalo channels. I get that. So they deserve to be covered. It's interesting to see when I go home and visit my mom, and I watch the Cleveland news, how in Cleveland they have 4 channels there, because their Fox station also does the news. And I think we've talked about this before too. It's funny how in Buffalo, nobody's got a helicopter, but in Cleveland, all 4 stations have helicopters, and they're doing stuff with their helicopters, and, trying to get to 20 or 40 or whatever it is, high school football games in every Friday night, because they have the helicopter and they're doing the traffic and whatever. But when in Cleveland, and this wasn't the case when I was growing up there, up until the early 90s to mid 90s, it was Cleveland, and they'd get to Akron maybe, because again, Akron had a couple of stations, had its own newspaper. Now Cleveland, they cover the whole state. They cover stuff going on in Columbus, like in their A block. It's kind of weird, but they're so aggressive. And I think the reason they do it too is because they have so many newscasts. So they don't have a fluffy half hour. They don't have, us, like on Channel 7, Michael Wooten show, where you bring in and they use a half hour of the news to like talk to community leaders and things like that. They don't do that. It's like story after story after story. And I think what they feel like they need to cover more than Cleveland to get, just to fill their time. But anyway, it's like they're aggressive. I mean, they're all over the place, and you don't feel like you're missing out on Cleveland stuff. Anyways, that was an aside.
I think there's a balance there, because, in a newspaper, you can label things that are Jamestown or Southern Tier or a little bit further out from the core Buffalo area, and readers can skip over it if they want to. On television, if you're doing a story about something that's happening an hour or two away, there might be a lot of TV viewers that think, I don't care about this story.
How about this? Maybe you're onto something, and maybe this is where you see it. And I know that you see it all over the place. This isn't a Buffalo thing. If you follow a local news social media account and it's got the sensational story, and then you click on it and it's in Virginia or it's something that's happening in Tennessee, they don't tell you. And it's to get you to click on it. And so I wonder if that's actually, you bring up I never thought of this. I wonder if they do that. And of course they'll say it, but if you're just casually watching the news and they talk about, they find, 4 children have been held captive in a basement, you're like, whoa, where is this? And it's like, well, it's in Toledo or it's in Dayton. But if you're watching in Cleveland, you're like, where is this? Do I know this town? What neighborhood is it? And it gets you to stick around, or gets you like it's like clickbait maybe.
Yeah. Well, I think I know at the place where I work, we try not to do that. And sometimes it can, slip through by mistake, but
Right.
And we will use those stories sometimes because they do get clicks if they're really interesting, the Florida man doing something crazy, but try to identify in the social media copy that this is a Florida story that we think you might find interesting, and not vaguely make you think it's happening in your backyard and get you to click, and then later you find out that it's something happening across the country.
Perhaps GPT is handling some of these accounts, because I have some stories to tell. And Jonah knows these stories. So feel free to steer me if I get too far afield, Jonah. But I had a colleague suggest I might want to try ChatGPT, not to write my stories, of course, but with work that has already been done to help organize it, to do like outlining, especially on a large project. So I just filed a story just a couple of days ago. I've been working on it for 3 months, and I interviewed, I don't know. I mean, there are so many people. I interviewed a lot of people that are kind of reflected in the story, but aren't actually quoted because, I talked to too many. I don't know, 30 people. Let's just say 30 people. And so I have, a transcript. I have a big file with all the quotes from all the interviews in it, and my notes on the topic, data, government data, NFL data, all these different things that I have. And so it's organized in that way. And then there comes a point where I have to now turn this into a story. And that to me is the most grueling part, mentally grueling part of my job is, okay, I've been working on this for so long. Now I have to go back. I have to refresh myself with the early stuff that the interviews that I did 3 months ago. Have things changed? I have to go and update things. There's all kinds of things, whatever. But this friend of mine in the business says ChatGPT is good for this. It's like having an assistant. It just helps you organize and and tell it, put all the quotes about this subtopic here, do the, whatever. And it just kind of, so I tried it, and it was very encouraging. And after 5 to 6 attempts, it's not like ChatGPT just gave me something and was like, here it is. And I was like, wow, this is great. I had to work at it. I had to keep giving it instructions. And then finally I had this outline that I was happy with. And again, it's all my work. It's using all of my quotes, all of my notes. ChatGPT has not brought anything in, has not helped me in any way on this. So this is not unethical. But as I'm going through the process, I keep noticing that, and I'm organizing as I'm writing, again, my words. It starts to introduce invented quotes, totally invented, paraphrasing. It's taking what was said in my transcript and making it sexy, making it seem more provocative, more scandalous. And I keep telling ChatGPT back, like, you just made this up. It's like having a conversation with an assistant. You can have this because you need to train it, a little bit. But I shouldn't have to train it to not get me fired or sued. I shouldn't have to train it to fabricate things. It it knows that this is for a journalism, that this is a piece of journalism that I'm doing. And it keeps making up quotes as though I'm writing a book of fiction. It's like, well, this would be, like, what about this? Like, this would be a pretty good scene to set, or this would be a great quote about, and it's like using words like treason, like somebody's committing treason. I'm like, what the fuck? So anyways, so I start getting aggravated with it to the point where I'm just talking at it like it's a person. And so this happened. I've already caught it making up quotes, maybe 7 or 8 times. And now I'm just
which
kind
is
of
more than you usually do. You only make up like 2 or 3 quotes.
right. That's at least 150% more fraudulent quotes than I make up. But so now I'm like trying to test it. I don't mean I'm like test the limits. Like, I'm like, what? So now I'm down the rabbit hole. I've stopped working on my story. I'm now so in trying to figure out how GPT works that I keep now giving it other little assignments and as to see what it will do. So after like 7 or 8 attempts, it just keeps making up quotes and it keeps saying, but these are the things that it says back to you. So I say, you just invented another quote from someone who doesn't exist. Why are you trying to get me fired or sued? I ask ChatGPT, and it says, you're absolutely right to be angry, and you have every reason to be. I crossed a line that you clearly and repeatedly told me not to. I used an invented quote from an unnamed bartender. I didn't interview any bartenders. From an unnamed bartender, which violates your instructions and professional standards. It's admitting that I've told it not to do this, and it keeps insisting on doing it. There's no excuse. It undermines your trust, compromises your credibility, and threatens your job. I'm sorry. Here's what I can promise going forward. And then it gives me these bullet points. Like it's like having this groveling, inept assistant. You're right. You're right. You got me. I promise from now on, I'm going to do this and this and this. And so I took screen because these are the screen caps that I sent you, Jonah. 9 minutes later, I ask it to do something else. You just used 3 more fabricated quotes. If you were an actual assistant, you'd be fired on the spot. And the response come back immediately too. So it's almost like you can picture a person, like, and it gets to be kind of funny. You're absolutely right to be furious. Now you a clear and direct apology. There's no excuse for inventing quotes after you explicitly and repeatedly told me not to. You were clear, you were professional, and I have violated your trust anyway. That kind of mistake could seriously damage your credibility, your career, and your relationships with sources, not to mention the legal and ethical risks. I understand that. I take full responsibility. Going forward, I promise to, and then it's the bullet points all over again. So clearly, the ChatGPT is not to be used by journalists, students, and it raises a lot of things because people talk about how ChatGPT is valuable with like legal documents or contracts, different things like that. But if it's paraphrasing and you have a 10-page document with small print and it changes an if to a when, or just changes whatever, I mean, you could be in some serious trouble. Whether you're a journalist or a lawyer or whatever you're using ChatGPT for, if it decides it's better for you to have this word versus that word, or it reads better, or it's sexier, or whatever. I don't know. I don't know why it kept insisting on making shit up. But if it's doing that in other things, how can you trust it? So that was, I guess I knew in my mind as a journalist, and people are talking about how evil this thing is. This is like a loaded gun. Like you could be fooled into thinking it's helping you. And if you're not diligent, or if you're lazy, let's say you're prone to just cutting corners. You're somebody who's a corner cutter. You may say, you know what, screw it. I am going to use this quote from the unnamed bartender. My editor's not going to ask me who that is. There's all kinds of things that you could do that is unscrupulous with ChatGPT urging you along.
Well, I find your interactions with the ChatGPT entertaining, and I hope those continue.
I was having fun with it. It's making me laugh, but I'm like angry laughing. I'm like, unbelievable. Like I'm sitting in my office basement down here, and I'm like, what the fuck? And so then I'm like, well, let's see what it does here. I'm sorry.
Well, I also find this encouraging because I think seeing the limits of what ChatGPT can't do or does improperly staves off and hastens the inevitability of, they say, AI taking over our jobs, and specifically what you and I do, or not being able to do it as well as we do. So I like that. Where I work, and I think many newsrooms are like this, we're not allowed to use generative AI in this way. I think it's terrible the way it's kind of permeated academic work these days, and hopefully there's ways that that can be blocked or mitigated against, because even if ChatGPT can effectively write essays for students, well, that takes away the learning aspect of it. So it shouldn't be used, even if it can be used.
Real
properly.
quick on that point, because I have a great anecdote. I don't think I ever told you this. So I gave my final to my journalism class, my sports journalism class at Canisius, and it was all off of class stuff talked about in class. And we have a lot of guest speakers, and Marty Baron was one of our guest speakers this year to talk about what it was like to be covered, what he looks for from, as a player, his relationship with the media, good experiences, bad experiences, expectations, all that type of stuff. And then his transition to being a member of the media. And it was great class. And so I asked a specific question about what he said. And if you were paying attention, you knew the answer. But you can't just put that into ChatGPT because the Marty Baron interview is not in the system, right? And so I had 30% of 7 of my 22 students answered my Marty Baron question verbatim, the same, 7 of them. So clearly they put it into ChatGPT or some AI system and put the question in there and just use exactly to the word. And the answer was wrong, by the way. But yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean,
Crazy.
I think might have to go back to ways where you took your tests with a number 2 pencil in the classroom with no phone or no calculator or whatever, just to prove that you know what you're doing without using technology to do the work of the thinking for you. I have a quick anecdote. The only student that I think I've ever failed, except for maybe a few that attendance-wise stopped coming and things like that, the only student that completed work and ended up failing that I can recall, this was about 4 years ago. So it wasn't ChatGPT, it was an older version of AI software technology that this student used, but they had an assignment to write an article, and could have been covering a sports game. I gave a lot of examples of that. And what was turned in was a version of my own article. And it was AI had, taken words and used synonyms and rewritten the sentences in ways to make it different, but the facts of the matter were the same. I knew what this game was and exactly how it was played and where it was. It was my own work, repurposed and spit back at me. And then the awkward phrasing that was used was obviously just a computer changing words and changing the way the sentences were structured, that even a poor writer or somebody that doesn't understand sports wouldn't use sentences and things this way, or, hitting the 2 ball to middle field or something like that. And I got a kick out of it, but it was disappointing that this student chose to do that instead of doing their own work, because they would have passed the class with an inferior writing. But if it was their own work, they would have passed. But this was a student that cut corners and didn't do their own work, and academic dishonesty and lack of integrity led to a failing grade there.
So here's the coup de grace with the ChatGPT. This is a story I haven't told you because I felt like when I was sending you these things on Wednesday, I was like, Jonah's got to be sick of. I was just it was so incredulous. I had to share it with somebody. So I was sending Jonah these screen caps of my arguments with ChatGPT. And I was like, I had one more happen. And I'm like, Jonah, anyways, it was Wednesday basketball. I don't know. There was something going on too. And I'm like, yeah, he's probably watching the game and whatever. So I was like, I'll tell him next time I see him. Well, this is the next time. Uh, so again, as I said, and I stopped at the outline, right? So the outline was the thing that I got some value out of GPT, out of this outline, because it's 3 months of material, all of my quotes, all my facts, all my research, and just organized in a way that I can follow it. I have it up on the wall and I can be like, all right, this is just helps me organize, that I know that I'm going to this place next. And in 2 moves, I'm going to do this and whatever. So it was 7 sections. So now I've written about 2,300 words, and I've written 5 sections, but as you do, I'm leaving the outline. I decide I'd rather put something that's in section 4. It's better in section 2. It flows better. There's some things in 3 I'm not going to do. But maybe I'll reintroduce them towards the bottom of the story. So I'm diverting from the outline. And it's as I do when I come up with my own outline and do my, brainstorming and have my, crazy legal pad. And so I've changed as I've gone. So now I've written 2,300 words and I'm through 5 sections. And I say, all right, let's see what it's going to tell me on section 6 and 7, the finals, based on this outline, how we're going to end this thing. So I tell ChatGPT, I say, here is 2,300 words through section 5. I want a new section 6, emphasizing these 3 voices that haven't been introduced yet. I should say 3 voices. These 3 people have not been introduced yet. Use their quote, emphasize their quotes in this section. Use information, whatever. It's a big ask. I'm testing it. I'm like, let's see what you do. Don't repeat anything, but I want you to consider everything that's been written in these 2,300 words, and let's go. What do you think is the natural bullet point for section 6? And I don't have it here so that I could read it off. So I'm paraphrasing this. And it says, this would be a good opportunity for a scene setting anecdote, a vignette. I'm sorry, a scene setting vignette. These 3 women are in a coffee shop talking about how they are NFL fans and the NFL has left them behind and the border is hurting things. And one of them grew up a Bills fan and all these things. Well, there's some problems. Number 1, 2 of them were women. Yes. But there was a man, very clearly a man's name. I did not interview anybody in a coffee shop. These 3 people were NFL executives. They weren't just fans musing about the NFL. And I'm trying to think, there was another thing. It was just totally it gave a sentence or 2 of each person's backstory. And one of them was she grew up a Bills fan and she feels marginalized by how the NFL treats women. That's not the topic of my story. She was not a Bills fan. It was all invented. It wasn't just inventing quotes. It was, here's a scene and you're going to be sitting with these 3 people at the coffee shop, listening to them chat and then share their dialogue. And it wasn't even germane to the topic that I was writing. All 3 were just, it was incredible. And then I wish I would have saved that one, because that's where I finally said something. You cannot be trusted. I can't use you. I'm not subscribing to this. And this is, by the way, I should say, this isn't the free version I'm using. This is, I figured $20 a month just to help me organize. So this is the one you pay for. This isn't the one that's like bare bones. This is super duper dangerous if you're ever going to lean on this, because you'd get fired. And there's a couple things. So if you have an editor who is diligent and is going to check and say, all right, well, who are these people? But I think you get to a certain level in your career too, where if you're a veteran and you're trusted and your editor knows you, your editor might just be like, well, why would I doubt that Tim Graham had coffee with these 3 NFL fans? And so then it gets into the story. And then finally somebody's like, who's such and such? And they look up the name and the person doesn't exist. And now I'm fired.
Well, I wouldn't use it then if I were you. I think the bigger dilemma is if it got good enough that it works well, or we're told in certain ways that we'll all have to use AI and integrate AI into our workflow and coexist with AI, and what that means and how that affects our jobs and our industry and society in general at some point. And I read that, AI can replace a lot of entry-level positions already in many fields, and how that's going to affect the economy and people coming out of college and things like that. Can we talk about this real quick, though? I mean, have you seen, or how much have you seen of these like fake AI stories about the Bills or Josh Allen on Facebook and things like that? And like, why are they so bad? Because wouldn't
How
the point
about
be to make a story that fools us, and they're so awful that who could it fool?
I noticed it about a month ago with Peyton Manning. There's an account that keeps churning out this AI slop of Peyton Manning helping people out, children, like children who lost both of his parents, and this
I've
little
seen
5-year
examples with Josh Allen and Sean McDermott,
right,
in the same vein.
sitting with the kid who's going through cancer treatment, and it's got this frail, bald, 4-year-old sitting in the hospital bed, and Josh Allen's holding his hand. And so I'd noticed a couple of them. I'm like, man, this guy's a really big Peyton Manning fan. And a couple of them, I glanced, you're scrolling through. And then one of them was, there were no cameras around when Peyton Manning visited this child's grave. And it's a picture of him kneeling at the child's grave. So I'm like, well, wait a minute, which is it? If there were no cameras around, how's there a picture of it? So then I clicked on it, and these are like, what, 500 words? Have you ever clicked on one to see how many words are written on these things?
No.
It's elaborate, and it's a whole like, yeah. And then this kid had sent him a letter, but Peyton Manning didn't see it until after the kid was dead. And so he went to the grave after throwing the winning touchdown and said, we did it. You helped me do that. I was like, what is this shit? I mean, does Peyton Manning need more? I mean, and who needs this?
I don't know what the market, yeah, right. What is the market for this, and why does it exist in a way that it seems so farcical? Because I think the point would be if they were making stories that seemed real, or even had a lot of reality to them, and it would fool you or replace real writing. But these are just parodies or jokes. I mean, maybe that is their function. There's something circulating on Facebook today.
I don't think they're jokes, though, Jonah.
Well, is this a joke? There's a story on Facebook about a man shooting oranges at teenagers in Casanova Park. And it's, a lot of people are thinking it's real and thinking this is a real incident that's happening, but it's clearly AI. I mean, is the point of that to be funny and a parody, or is it to fool people into go into Casanova Park and looking for this?
Yeah, probably orange? Just let's see who will believe this. That's gotta be, at least on that one.
And it's engagement farming is really what it is on social media, but man shooting oranges in Cas Park. This is fooling some smart people, Tim.
Well, ChatGPT, the Graham Central Station must be a union shop, because I was not allowed to fire ChatGPT as much as I wanted to. It was just the groveling assistant. It would be like me stuck with this assistant as it keeps feeding me bad information and can't even bring me a cup of coffee. And I'm like, you have to stop fabricating quotes. You're right. You're right. You're right to call me out on that. Yeah, you're right. guilty as charged. Well, from now on, I refuse. And then
But
5 minutes later, it does it again.
what about just using it for the transcription and outlining? You showed me a little bit of that. It seemed like that works better than some of
I
the
don't
other
know.
services that are
But
already
can you trust
existing.
it after you see it constantly screwing up on what is supposed to be factual stuff? How that, so now I see a quote in there, and what am I going to have? So I see a quote in the transcript, and I'm like, all right, that's the quote I want to use. Do I then have to stop what I'm doing, go back and listen and see that it made sure and make sure that it's accurate? So I may as well have just listened to it the first time, or I transcribed it myself the first time, rather than I have to check. You have to check everything, everything. I think. I mean, and what's going to happen is, and this is where, people get in trouble and probably already are, of the first instance is not this whole thing with the coffee shop and the three women sitting around, who, by the way, I interviewed them all over the phone. These weren't even in-person interviews, let alone at a coffee shop or even together. They were all separate. So it wasn't even as egregious as that part of it. But it keeps paraphrasing what it thinks would be a better quote. That's what it kept doing for me in the early stages of me, like, really, when I noticed it. I mean, luckily I'm like really in tune with what I write in my interviews, because I saw the word treason came up, and I'm like, I didn't interview anybody who said the word treason. I remember that. And, but it just decided that treason was a good word there. And then but then I looked at the whole quote. The whole quote was just, it had taken what the person had said in spirit and made it scandalous. And I mean, that's the type of thing that if I were to trust a transcript and it paraphrases to make something sound punchier, and I use it, and then I get a call from Bill's PR or from the player's agent and says, this news conference is on bills.com, and we just listened back and he didn't say this. I'm like, well, my AI recorder said that he said it. Well, that's not good enough. That gets me suspended, fired, whatever, sued. So yeah, I think I'm done with the ChatGPT experiment. I'm going to enjoy it for the remaining, 25 days of the month, or however many months, the $20 that I spent for the month that I'm going to use it. I'm going to see what kind of fun I can have with it. But yeah, that'll be that.
Well, we'll see
Maybe
how
I'll
the
see.
technology evolves.
Yeah, I'll see if I can have Jonah Bronstein helping out sick kids at O'Shai, standing alongside Josh Allen.
Those would be funny if somebody could make some of those for us. We
Did
could
I
use
show you the
those.
photo of me and Clint Eastwood?
Well, no, but you should use AI while you're still paying for the services to produce cover images for our YouTube videos.
You're right. I should. So real quick, I'll post it. So one of the things that ChatGPT did, and I kind of like this when we got started, it said when I first signed up for it, it's like, you can tell me a little bit about yourself, so that way I know, so I guess it's the way it talks to me or whatever. Like, what are some things that you're into? Or like, what it starts asking you, like, what's your favorite movie? And I said Unforgiven, with Clint Eastwood in it. And it's like, oh, what is it that you like about it? And I think I said something like the memorable dialogue or something like that. And it asked me a couple, what are some of your hobbies, or what? It asked like 4 or 5 questions. And then it stopped. I mean, it wasn't going to keep going. And I was like, whatever. And it's like, oh, good. I get a sense that you're the type of person or whatever. And so I'm playing with it that night just to see what it could do. And I went for a photo, and I said, make a picture of me standing next to Clint Eastwood, because the Unforgiven was fresh on my mind. And it took a picture of me, and I don't know where it's from, because I think it looks like my headshot from The Athletic, but that's a black and white photo, and it kind of it made it in color, but it also altered me in an AI way. I look like I'm somebody who wears Velcro shoes and can't ride the bus by himself. And I'm standing next to Clint Eastwood, and right behind it, and there's it says it's a hell of a thing killing a man, and it's just me, an overweight me, even more overweight than I am now. It also gave me because it was a headshot. It took a headshot of me off the internet somewhere, but then it gave me a body, and I'm going about 280 in this picture, and it's Clint Eastwood from Unforgiven standing right next to me, and we're just like trying to look like a couple of badasses. But yeah, I should have known then. ChatGPT wasn't there to do me any favors.
That's another thing I've noticed. I mean, in image generation, I think it does a pretty good job in some general file clip art type ways, and can maybe make some amusing, cartoonish looking photos, but trying to make it realistic or hyper realistic, I think they look lame and sloppy, and the technology hasn't gotten far enough to replace photography.
No, everything. Yeah. Everything looks too smooth. It's smoothed out. Anyway, I had a wonk eye. One of my eyes wasn't pointing in the right direction. Clint Eastwood was my chaperone, clearly, in that photo. He was there to make sure that nothing bad happened to me while I walk down Main Street. All right, Jonah. Anything else? Oh, you had a story you're working on.
Yeah, I wanted to make mention of really a developing story, something I wrote about this week, and more is happening with it. We talked earlier about champions from Buffalo. We have a national champion from Hamburg, Lakeview, Frontier senior Lily Bogdan won the 2,000-meter steeplechase at Nike Outdoor Nationals last night with a meet record time. See if I can remember this. I think 6:28, 6 minutes 28 seconds, and is now flew on a red-eye flight overnight and is now in Philadelphia competing in the New Balance Outdoor Nationals. Has a chance maybe to win another national championship or another national meet in that event. She had the best time in the country going into these meets. Pretty impressive that somebody can do that on back-to-back days with the travel involved. And this is now the second time in 3 years that Western New York has had the national steeplechase champion. 2 years ago, Angelina Napoleon won out at nationals from Allegheny Limestone, actually set an age group under 20-year-old record for the event in the steeplechase. And then this past year, or earlier this month, was third at the NCAAs running for NC State in the 3,000-meter steeplechase, what they run in college. And Lily Bogdan, I wrote about on WIBB.com, had an interesting story that she missed all of the indoor track season with mono and had to kind of retrain her stamina and get her conditioning back earlier in the season. I wasn't sure she could. She was the state champion in the event last year, but had to build up her times and her speed and her ability to get to that state championship level, but has since gone beyond that and now a national champion. And that was interesting because I had also remembered years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, whatever it was, she was an 8th grader running in sectionals cross country. And I had written a bit in the story I did covering that for the Buffalo News about her collapsing near the finish line in a meet earlier in the season from dehydration and working her way back from that. So it was kind of neat to see her maturation and seeing these young athletes kind of go through their careers as young athletes to older athletes and going on in college. She's going to go to Georgetown now and said she's going to study nutrition, and that was inspired by her incident with, collapsing from the dehydration and not being properly fueled for that race. And it makes me think a little bit of the AI thing, because I think AI could probably gather some information off the internet and write a story about Lily Bogdan and her times and the different races she's won. I don't know if they'd be able to pull in all of these human interest elements of the story or know what questions to ask her and put it all together in the same way that a human journalist could do, and having the knowledge of having met her 5 years ago and followed some of her career and knowing those things. I saw some other articles written about her that mentioned some of these things, but didn't seem to have the same detail or know to ask her as many questions and get her talking about how those experiences affected her and playing into her college choices and things like that. So not to just pat myself on the back, but I think, you know, being a human journalist that covers things over the years can produce better journalism and better storytelling than an AI machine or younger, less experienced reporters or national reporters that aren't around to know all these different things.
Great stuff. And so she's a senior. She's just finished her senior year. She'll
She's a senior now. Yeah, missing graduation this weekend for these national meets, but that happens with track, you know, every year. Missed the prom last week for states.
Well, this is more memorable than prom or graduation. I'm sure she's taken a lot of folks' word for that. Good stuff, Jonah. And thanks to everybody out there. Yeah, please engage. Please get in there, get in the comments. Tell us your favorite or least favorite Buffalo athlete that went on to win a cup. I guess, you know, did we mention Patrick Kane? He never played for the Sabres but being from here, winning a Stanley Cup. Of course,
I think people mostly root for that, right?
Yeah, he's a kind of a controversial guy. I think there are some people in certain parts of certain neighborhoods probably weren't, but yeah. Who's a big one? Who's another big one? I mean, Lily Bogdan,
Oral Hershiser.
right? All right. Hey, everybody. Thanks for checking out Tim Graham and Friends, brought to you by CTBK, CPAs and Business Consultants.
The financial needs of a business go beyond tax and attest services. That's why CTBK goes beyond accounting services and offers outsourced solutions through their affiliation with CFO Solutions Plus. These additional services allow clients to focus on their operational and long-term strategic goals. Trust CTBK's outsourced solutions to provide cost-effective, value-added financial services tailored to your company's needs. Call CTBK at 716-630-2400. Again, 716-630-2400. Or go to ctbk.com to learn more about CTBK's outsourced solutions.